Hello, and welcome to today's NTIA Pre-NOFO Technical Assistance webinar. Today's topic will be a stakeholder engagement overview in preparation for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act broadband programs, which were authorized to NTIA. Today, we have a pretty full agenda, but first I want to introduce myself. My name is Gilbert Resendez, and I'm a broadband program specialist here with NTIA in the Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth, and I will be your host and moderator for today. First, we are going to have some welcoming remarks from Andy Burke, who is NTIA's Special Representative for Broadband. Next, we'll do an engagement and partnerships overview before transitioning to questions and answers, which will be moderated by myself. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Andy Burke. Andy served as the mayor of Chattanooga, Tennessee from 2013 to 2021. Under his leadership, Chattanooga established several digital equity programs, including Tech Goes Home, which offered technology training, skills, and access to families. At the end of his term, Mayor Burke led a partnership to provide high-speed broadband at no cost to every family on free and reduced lunch, making Chattanooga the first community in the country with such a benefit. As a native of Chattanooga, Mayor Burke served in the Tennessee Senate for 5 years prior to his mayoralty. Please join me in welcoming Andy Burke.
Thanks, Gilbert. And we appreciate each and every one of you for joining today's webinar. This is a transformational moment in the history of the web. The President of the United States has made a commitment that every American will have access to affordable, reliable broadband, and a bipartisan group of legislators in Congress have made sure that it's funded and it's going to happen. I am so excited to be working in this area. It's something that I have been talking about, working on for a long time, and now we're seeing it come to fruition. NTIA has a talented group of people. You're going to see some of them today in the webinar, but in the long run, the implementation where the fiber meets the trenches is in the states and cities across this country. You're the ones who are going to make this happen. We know that people are talking about engagement and stakeholders, how we get this done around the country. I know that because I've been out on the road, not just here in discussions with people about the policies, but also talking to state leaders, local leaders, people in nonprofits. I come from that background, and that's what I've been hearing about. We are so appreciative of your diligence, of your advocacy, of the work that you've already put in and are only going to accelerate as these things move forward. We've got broadband equity access and deployment program. We've got digital equity funds. All those pieces will come together in your city, your town, your village, your state. Thank you so much for being here today, and have a great webinar.
Thank you very much, Andy. Now we will transition to the main part of our webinar, the engagements and partnerships overview. I'd first like to take this chance to introduce my colleagues. Again, my name is Gilbert Resendez, and I'm a broadband program specialist here at NTIA. I'm also joined today by my colleague, Julia Pulidendi, who is also a broadband program specialist in the Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth at NTIA, focusing on local outreach and engagement. And I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Michelle Morton, who is a broadband program specialist focusing on digital equity issues in the Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth here at NTIA. Before we get started, I want to go over one housekeeping item, what today's webinar is and what today's webinar is not. First, I'd like to say there are a lot of variations in state and local contexts, and stakeholder engagement can and should vary depending on that context. We suggest, in addition to this webinar, you engage with other states and other localities to learn more about what works for them. This webinar is stakeholder engagement, thought starters, and tips for states and localities. This webinar is not and should not be misconstrued to be guidance on outreach requirements that will be included in the IIJA notices of funding opportunities. Before we get started, I would like to give an overview of the money that NTIA will be administering. NTIA will be administering about $48 billion in new broadband funding programs created by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Those are broken down as follows. First, we have the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, which is a $42.45 billion state and territory formula program to close the availability gap as Congress found it in the legislation. The next set of programs are all found under the Digital Equity Act, which is a $2.75 billion program or billion-dollar pot of funding, which establishes a state planning grant program, a state capacity grant program, and competitive grant programs to support the closure of the digital divide and promote digital equity and inclusion so that Americans can fully participate in society and the economy. The next program is a $1 billion middle mile program called the Enabling Middle Mile Broadband Infrastructure Program. It is direct competitive grants on a technology neutral basis to encourage the expansion and extension of middle mile infrastructure. And the final, but not least program in this $48 billion is the $2 billion Tribal Broadband Connectivity Technical Amendments. These are grants to eligible entities with approved applications. This piece of the legislation provides new funds and extends expenditure deadlines for NTIA's current Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program. Well, next, I would like to give an overview of the state focus during the first 6 to 12 months of the post-NOFO and what will likely be broadband plan development. It's important to first note that the steps that we've laid out here are not a linear flow through of these activities. Entities will have to move back and forth along the sample state activities, and these are sample state activities, depending on where they're at in their process. Examples of these state activities may include drafting letters of intent or a letter of intent for the Bead program, creating or compiling their application for the planning grant under the Digital Equity Act, plan development for both the plans required in the Bead and DEA programs, plan socialization and approval. And again, these will more than likely be fluid and are not linear by any means. States will then move to the sub-granting process, program implementation, evaluation, and monitoring process, in addition to their ongoing broadband efforts. Additionally, today's focus will focus on the potential stakeholder engagement activities and considerations to do before and during broadband plan development. Finally, I would like to give an overview of stakeholder engagement that is both required by the IIJA statute and key to program success. The IIJA, or again, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, introduced minimum collaboration requirements. For example, under the Bead program, 5-year action plans shall be informed, or the legislation states that those action plans shall be informed by collaboration with local and regional entities. Additionally, the initial and final proposals of the Bead programs should include a description or shall include a description of coordination with local governments along with other local regional broadband planning purposes. The DEA program also has similar specific requirements, such as including a description of how the state plans to collaborate with key stakeholders, which includes localities, and then a list of organizations which the state's administering entity is collaborating with to develop and deploy these plans or implement these plans. Until NTIA releases our notices of funding opportunities, these statutory mandates are the minimum program requirements, and that's an important thing to note here. Additionally, we at NTIA want to point out that there are several benefits from local stakeholder engagement. First, it opens a dialogue to better identify and understand community needs and how to prioritize. Next, it allows to tap into diverse expertise within the communities across your states. It also builds early buy-in for your broadband plan and fosters joint ownership of your mission through partnerships. It also improves transparency, which can build trust by demonstrating responsible stewardship of resources, and it energizes stakeholders. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Julia Puladenti, for the next set of the webinar.
Thanks, Gilbert. So this presentation will focus on stakeholder engagement, and what we aim to do is to provide some suggestions or tips that'll help state and local governments as they prepare to engage with stakeholders in the development of their state broadband plans. There are three critical components of engagement: planning your strategy, tailoring your approach to various stakeholders, and that initial engagement with them. I'll be focusing on planning your strategy, which includes identifying who you'll engage with, determining how states and localities will work together on this. I'll also talk about engagement processes and relationships that currently exist that you can leverage for this broadband effort, identifying who will be responsible for engagement and managing capacity for it, and tracking the impact of your engagement. One of the most important factors of your engagement will be to ensure that you have a large and diverse stakeholder group. We've defined a stakeholder as an individual, group, or organization that's involved in, impacted by, or simply interested in state and local broadband efforts. Having this large and diverse engagement will ensure that states and localities are developing a broadband plan that's inclusive, ambitious, and truly responsive to the needs of the community. We've grouped the common types of stakeholders you'll engage with into three buckets. The first one is public sector, which will include the federal government, state agencies or departments like housing or transportation, federal, state, and local elected officials, counties, cities, and other political subdivisions of the state, tribal governments, and public utility commissions. Private sector stakeholders will include service providers, economic development organizations and chambers of commerce, and local businesses. And finally, community organizations will include nonprofit organizations, community anchor institutions such as healthcare facilities, libraries, and academic institutions, community-based organizations, coalitions and associations, community activists, residents, community leaders, and faith-based organizations. It's important to note that each community is unique, and you may have other key entities that you'll want to include in your broadband conversations. So state and local governments will each have distinct responsibilities on stakeholder engagement, but they can find ways for their work to dovetail with each other. The legislation calls on states to coordinate with localities, so it's likely that they'll be the primary drivers of the development of statewide broadband plans, either by developing it themselves in conjunction with that local coordination, or by identifying an administering entity who will create and execute the plan. Localities, being the closest level of government to the community, will be key in determining and understanding unique local needs and priorities, as well as having a knowledge of current broadband projects. They'll also be a resource for states in ensuring underrepresented populations are engaged, and for communicating these local insights back to the states. While states and localities have distinct roles and responsibilities, there are areas where their work can inform each other. For example, they might find it helpful to collaborate on identifying existing engagement processes and mechanisms. They can also discuss defining engagement roles and who will take the lead on what, so that they can maximize efficiency and reach to ensure that underrepresented populations are heard. They can also coordinate on resource and information collection so that there's a feedback mechanism between state and local governments. And finally, they can share and leverage existing state, local, and regional resources, such as local broadband plans or mapping efforts. They can help connect communities who are already doing this work on broadband to those that are looking for guidance on how to start. One example of where states and local governments will work together is on identifying community needs. Localities, again, because of their proximity to the community, can collect this information through whatever mechanism they've determined that works for them, whether it's by mapping, surveys, or community town halls, and then communicate that to the states. States, on the other hand, will take it from there by collecting and logging this information so that it can be integrated into their state development, state plan development and implementation. Another area of collaboration and support will be in technical assistance. Stakeholder engagement will be a big lift, so localities will need to review internal capacity and needs, and states can help build technical assistance plans and guidance for localities based on these needs. So state and local governments are not new to the engagement game. This is something that they've been working on for years, maybe not on broadband, but to address other pressing community needs. So it's important to look at existing processes to see how you can leverage those. This means looking at how existing partners and stakeholders are engaged, what mechanisms are used for that engagement, and how you develop topics of conversation for your stakeholder groups. Finally, it's also important to determine how often you engage then. Might be helpful to look at other state or local departments who oversee engagement, like your departments of health or transportation at the state level, or your planning department at the local level, to see how the community at large is currently engaged and how you can modify those processes for your broadband discussions. Another area of work you may already have expertise on is ensuring a wide and broad representation of stakeholders. This means making sure you have a broad geographic coverage of your community, a diverse group of stakeholders. You're including the unserved and underserved communities, so underrepresented groups and covered populations as defined by the Digital Equity Act. Next, look at the stakeholders and partners you currently engage, and if they may have expertise in some of the discussions that may come up during your broadband planning. For example, some of these groups might have technical expertise in broadband planning or mapping or community building that might be useful for you to leverage. Understanding and identifying stakeholders that'll have the greatest impact in developing your broadband plans will make sure that you have the right people at the table for this. And finally, planning ahead for engagement will need to involve looking at any potential obstacles or challenges that may come up. So look to what you've done previously that's been successful in your state or localities to see what worked, what didn't, and how you troubleshooted any unforeseen issues that came up along the way. It's important for states and localities to determine what kind of staffing will be needed and if this is something that'll be added to existing staff's responsibilities or if a new role will be created. If it's a new role, you'll need to determine where this position will sit, who they'll report to, and the skill set needed to effectively engage your stakeholders. And if this is something that'll be added to an existing staff person's responsibilities, it'll be important to be aware of how much of a time commitment this will be for them to ensure that it doesn't conflict or get in the way of other tasks that they might have. Other areas of capacity that'll need to be determined is how you plan to engage your stakeholders and the resources you need for that, time and cost-wise. Webinars and other virtual engagements may be easier and faster to facilitate, but may involve a technology investment to ensure you have the right platform to effectively engage everyone. In-person meetings, on the other hand, will get you that face-to-face contact that can lead to more collaborative conversations, but can require a lot more staff time and logistical planning. And finally, tracking the impact of your engagement. It's important to determine early on in the process what successful engagement will look like for your state and locality, and to develop metrics for that. Tracking your metrics during your engagement from the beginning can ensure long-term sustainability of your broadband planning efforts. Creating some qualitative and quantitative metrics will help you track your engagement. These can take the form of contact lists, which are not only crucial for that initial engagement, but also for continued communication with your stakeholders. You can also determine what engagement mechanisms work best. You might find yourself needing to try a few strategies before identifying the one that works best for your unique group of stakeholders. And finally, for local governments, ensure that stakeholder comments and feedback are shared with the state. And for the states, it's important to make sure that these are incorporated into your broadband plans. Important to note that these are not going to be one-time conversations you have with your stakeholders. So the more states and localities can empower them to contribute and feel like their feedback will shape broadband planning efforts, the more continued and sustained engagement you'll have from them. And with that, I'll pass it off to my colleague, Michelle Morton, about how to tailor your approach to various stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. In these next slides, we are going to focus on tailoring your approach. Specifically, how can local governments develop approaches and messaging to engage with various stakeholder communities? As a reminder, these are some best practices or recommendations you can use to develop your strategies to engage with community-based organizations and community members. As localities start the engagement process, think about the following best practices. Invest early. To develop strong relationships with community-based organizations, first think about who are your stakeholders. As you begin to consider and identify your target groups, start by conducting outreach and developing working relationships. Consider informing community stakeholders about existing work or planned activities and projects. Building these relationships early on will be helpful in developing trust and co-building a shared vision. For example, some localities are working with CBOs to develop surveys and feasibility studies. Transparency is also critical as localities engage with CBOs. Communicating early and often builds trust and reinforces the importance of co-building process. Provide clear guidance on how information will be both shared and received. For example, as locality
I hope you can hear me. This is Macy Morin from the production side. So sorry that we are having video and audio issues. We're going to give it another minute, and if for whatever reason that doesn't work, we'll go ahead and have our moderator Gilbert Resendez hop on, and Julia Polidindi, who is one of our speakers, and we will have them start answering questions for you. And hope we can get the rest of it going, but definitely don't want to keep you waiting. Your time is precious to us. So apologize again for these technical difficulties. It's just the way it goes in times of COVID. So thanks again for your patience. We really appreciate it. I'll just hopping on one more time, just to let you know that we are trying to get the video back up, because I know that's what you're all here for. If not, we will definitely make the full recording available to you all afterwards. That way you can watch the full presentation as well as taking a part of our Q&A. We are trying to load it up here and hopefully it'll work. So keep your fingers crossed. Thanks.
Upon efficiencies, increase capacity, and identify areas of expertise needed to develop the plan. States and localities may not have all of the resources needed at this time, but stakeholder engagement offers opportunities to develop those resources and capacities from the stakeholder community, which can include conducting outreach, advocacy, launching projects and initiatives, and finding experts where capacity is limited. In this slide, you'll find helpful questions to ask yourself as you begin this process. Keep in mind that communicating a clear purpose for your stakeholder engagement will help you decide the best engagement approaches and activities. As noted in the previous slide, deciding the best engagement approach and activity is essential. States and localities can foster broad participation and awareness by using multiple approaches. This slide is a great example of strategies to stimulate participation and build awareness. This is what I would call the 4 C's of engagement: communication, consultation, coordination, and collaboration. Each of the C's shows the impact and level of effort from low touch to high touch. Consultation is a low touch approach with the goal of direct and targeted outreach to stakeholders to gather input. That can be achieved in a variety of methods, from town halls, door knocking campaigns to focus groups. This is best suited for collecting input on a specific ask and can help create buy-in from stakeholders to feel heard and prioritized. The collaboration approach is a high-touch level of engagement. It requires working alongside with stakeholders to help share in decision planning, decision-making, and failures. This type of effort is the most common tactic in forming working groups to help in development of socialization of the plan. This engagement approach is best suited for more complex issues that impact various groups and help create a feeling of ownership and responsibility. As you decide your engagement approaches, ensure that accessibility, inclusivity are at the forefront. Consider the cultural competency of your approaches and tactics. Where applicable, is literature written in multiple languages? Have you considered accessibility issues? Have you considered various types of communication channels best suited for the targeted audience? Phone calls, text campaigns, virtual or in-person conversations. Keep in mind that states and local governments will address the same topics, but will have different ways of engaging on them with their stakeholders. This slide shows examples of how some states and localities are implementing various engagement approaches. In Louisiana, Connect LA uses monthly newsletters to keep stakeholders aware of its progress, events, blogs, and share links to press articles on the initiative. The newsletter is featured on the Connect LA website and emailed to subscribers. This is a great example of a low-touch approach that keeps stakeholders informed and engaged. In Detroit, Connect 311 uses the consultation approach to gather direct input and data from the stakeholder community about their insights, knowledge, challenges, and needs. The Connect 311 team focused on both short-term and long-term needs of community members, such as distributing hotspots to help underserved residents gain at-home internet access, but also continuing to focus on long-term needs of building a sufficient broadband infrastructure to meet the increasing demands of affordable and sustainable connectivity. Oakland Undivided used the collaboration approach to create a multi-partner coalition of stakeholders, which included the City of Oakland, Oakland Unified School District, and multiple CBOs to address connectivity issues brought on by the pandemic. Through its efforts, Oakland Undivided created a tech check survey to assess and collect accurate information about the tech needs of the students in their households. In doing so, this allowed the Oakland Undivided team to target its efforts and resources to address the needs of low-income students. Last, in Minnesota, the governor's task force has used a higher touch approach to co-develop its vision for broadband connectivity with CBOs and providers. Members meet monthly and distribute an annual report. The task force serves as a bridge between coalitions and other broadband efforts across the state. Because this approach requires a higher level and more sustained level of engagement, all stakeholders have ownership and are more fully invested in achieving the goals in the plan. Keep in mind, approaches will vary and change over time and will shift as a result of the change in goals, objectives, and activities. Here are some examples of topics to address to stakeholders on building a foundation and moving toward success. Start with an assessment of the current state to gain a better understanding of needs, current efforts and projects, learn of untapped opportunities, and assess the gaps and hone in on priorities. As you begin to identify the barriers or roadblocks, also ask about who else should be included in the discussions. Use this as an opportunity to provide technical assistance and education, if needed, on topics like broadband or digital equity or mapping. Next, incorporate opportunities for your stakeholders to provide feedback during the pre-planning process and throughout the planning process. Solicit their feedback to keep them abreast of your progress and to gain additional insight or identify other opportunities or barriers not previously identified. This is an iterative process that should be transparent, improve relevancy, and maintain buy-in from the stakeholders. Begin to problem solve and brainstorm together by defining what success is and creating solutions together. Last, share call to action. Leverage your conversations about IIJA programs to create a call to action about broadband. Finding ways to collaborate on programs like the Affordable Connectivity Program or providing support to ongoing American Rescue Plan Act projects will build stronger relationships and help you start the planning process for IIJA funds sooner. This last slide is a great illustration for both states and localities on activities by engagement topic. You can use these activities as a starting place. For example, to assess the current state, states can coordinate with agencies and umbrella organizations that are producing and updating maps on current service maps. Localities can offer technical assistance to CBOs on how to improve broadband readiness across communities. As a suggestion, states and localities should reach out to stakeholders to ask what topics they would like to be involved in and ask where they can be most helpful. Seeking the advice and guidance from stakeholders can be helpful even in the early stages of trying to figure out who to reach out to and how. Now I'll turn it back over to Gilbert.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And right now we're about to head into our Q&A section, but before we do, I just have some next steps that I want to go over. First, as a reminder, stakeholder engagement is an ongoing process during the life cycle of a project, especially these broadband projects. They build trust and collaboration with stakeholders, and engagement can't be episodic. It should be an ongoing process. As broadband plans matures, the objectives of stakeholder engagements may change as you learn more information, but you should continually include that stakeholder thought and input throughout the broadband planning process. For further guidance, we have access to additional NTIA materials on our website, and they can be found on our state and local government page. And without further ado, this concludes our content piece of our webinar, and we will now move over to the Q&A section.
Right. Well, thank you, everyone. And again, we apologize for some of those technical difficulties that we had there in the middle. I know our team is working to make sure that those are resolved. So when the recording is posted to the website, that you will be able to hear the full recording on the website. And I do want to then go ahead and begin our Q&A section. So the first question that I see here for Julia and myself is, what should states be doing now to get ready to engage with localities? And Julia, if that's okay with you, I'll go ahead and take that one, since I tend to work with more of our state stakeholders. What states can do now in order to begin that stakeholder outreach and getting prepared to engage with localities is begin and do an inventory of who are your municipal leagues in your state, who's in leadership in the municipal league in your state, and where are the county associations, and who leads those county associations. Do those organizations have a broadband point of person or a person who has broadband as a part of their portfolio? Begin making the list of who you can begin meeting with. Julia, I don't know if you have anything else to add from a local perspective.
No, I think that is the most critical thing for states. There's so many local governments out there, and I think making sure state governments and state broadband offices are connected to those state municipal and county is probably a good one-stop shop or first step, making sure you're connecting with localities.
Yeah, I agree. So I guess kind of on the flip side, the next question that I see in the Q&A is, what should localities then be doing now to get ready for this funding?
So I actually have one big thing localities should be doing. There are a lot of things you all could be doing, but I think the most important thing is reaching out to your state broadband offices. Most of this money will be flowing through the states, and as we discussed, local coordination is required by the legislation of states. So I know states are going to be doing part to reach out to localities, but localities, you will need to do your part too to reach out to the states. If you don't know who your state broadband contact is, you can find that on the NTIA website on our state and local government page. You can find the State Broadband Leaders Network, and you can find who your state broadband contact is. If you're not comfortable doing that, please reach out to Broadband for All. And we're happy to connect you with your state broadband offices. And if you're not comfortable doing that, reach out again to your state, county, and municipal associations, because they may already have those relationships with them.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think always want to take a chance to plug NTIA State Broadband Leaders Network. That's the cohort that I help support for NTIA. Like Julia said, the contact information for those state broadband people, coordinators, directors, managers, are on the NTIA website, and I'm always more than happy to make an introduction as well to folks. So the next question in our queue is, how do I start conversations about broadband in my city, county, locality?
So, I think local governments vary across the board, and I'm going to list a couple city departments that we're hearing that are from people that we work with that are doing work right now. But your local government CIO or CTO office might be working on this. There are some communities that are doing broadband mapping efforts through their CIO or CTO office. So that's one good place to start. Another good place to start might be your planning department. I used to work for a local government, and the planning department facilitated community meetings on a monthly basis on various issues, most commonly zoning matters, but that could be one department in your particular community that already has an engagement process set with the community that you can reach to. Your transportation department, I know transportation decisions go through a public comment process, so that could be another agency to work in. The last one I want to mention is the school board. The school board that we've seen, and you all on the call probably are aware of this, particularly in the pandemic. The students and households with school-age children that didn't have access to internet were the hardest hit in the beginning. And the school boards and libraries and even healthcare institutions were doing a lot to make sure that those communities were connected. So I would also think about reaching out to them, because not only do they have that direct line to the community, they probably have had those conversations on broadband availability already.
Yeah, I think that's all excellent. Nothing else to add, I think. Let's see here. The next question that I have in our queue is, this webinar is great, thank you. But what are some other types of resources that NTIA is providing to get states ready, or to states to get ready to ensure that we are coordinating with all localities?
So, right, we're doing these webinars. Gilbert had mentioned our State Broadband Leaders Network, which we are heavily engaged with. And I should define the State Broadband Leaders Network for those of you who are not aware of it. It is a group of state broadband offices or departments in the state that are performing the function of broadband for that state. So we have regular conversations with them. We engage with them as often as we can. Whenever they have questions, we try to answer them. And we also have regular convenings with them. So what you may not see through these public webinars is kind of happening on the back end. We are engaging with them frequently on some of the questions they have.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that. We do engage frequently with that State Broadband Leaders Network. We actually just had a meeting yesterday. What are recommendations that we have for how to partner with counties? So this individual said that they are with a tower infrastructure development company, and they want to partner with counties to end the digital divide.
So I'll just kind of answer this question generally. If there's a particular county you're looking to work with, I would, look to see what kind of digital divide efforts they already have underway, and maybe reach out there. If there has been a champion on the county commission, they're obviously a person to reach out to. If you're generally looking for counties to work with, again, I would look at your state county associations. I don't mean to kind of sound like a broken record, but I have a feeling I'm going to be mentioning state county associations and state municipal associations a lot because they are truly a powerful force at the state level for governments, and I think they could be a good resource for you.
Absolutely. I think echoing that for a lot of these questions, I think working with, your state municipal leagues, your state county associations, our state SBLN, I think one thing that came across, or hopefully came across, is that partnerships and partnership development is key to these outreach activities, and a lot of those organizations have put in a lot of work to developing those partnerships and relationships. what are some guidelines or information that counties and or cities can start gathering now in order to attain everything needed to submit a letter of intent?
So just a little bit of a clarification there. States will actually be submitting letters of intent for the Bead program. So again, this is why it's going to be so important for you to make sure you're connecting with your state broadband offices. In terms of data that would be useful to take when you're having these conversations is understanding who's unserved and underserved and community anchor institutions that don't have access to gigabit connections in your communities. If you're able to take that information to your state broadband offices, I think that's a good way to start the conversation. The Bead program priorities are those three populations: unserved, underserved, and the anchor institutions without a gig connection. And then any kind of data or mapping efforts you can. Again, the purpose of this legislation is to make sure everybody has access to affordable, reliable internet. So identifying those pockets of the communities where access is a challenge and also affordability, that information will be crucial.
Absolutely. Agree to all of that. Are there grants that small rural counties can apply for?
So again, because a lot of this funding, most of the funding will be flowing through the states, you would be able to apply to the states for those funding, which again, important to talk to your state broadband offices now about that. But there are also other programs where localities can apply directly for those funds. And those are the Digital Equity Act Competitive Grant Program, which will open after the two other digital equity grant programs, and then also the Middle Mile Infrastructure Program.
Thank you. The next question I see in our queue is how much will be given to develop the state digital equity plans per state? Do we have that information right now?
Yes, there is a total of $60 million for states to apply for the planning piece of their digital equity plans. And then once that grant program finishes, there will be the state digital equity capacity grant program. And there's $1.44 million available for that. And that money is to be used for implementation of digital equity plans.
I know some of these questions may be questions that we're not able to answer at the moment. This may be one of them, Julia, so I apologize. I know we're still pre-NOFO for all of these programs. But do metropolitan planning organizations or Mpos count as regional entities for any of our programs?
So I actually saw this in the chat and I looked it up. I would talk to your state broadband office about that. I believe that MPO and regional council designations as a local or political jurisdiction, jurisdiction of the state, I think it depends on your individual state code. So I would have that conversation with your state broadband office and also your state transportation office for clarification on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think states do define what are political subdivisions. That may be a question to get clarification on from there. See here. What are some key policy questions which you would recommend that states take to local governments and other stakeholders for input? I'm not sure if we're able to provide guidance on that, but if we can.
Well, so not to punt it to a future webinar, but we are going to be doing an upcoming webinar on work enabling conditions. And these are some of the state and local policies that you can have in place that could expand or increase broadband expansion. Some of these are streamlining your permitting processes, dig once policies, microtrenching policies, understanding asset management and how to go about doing that. Our webinar that coming up in a couple weeks will focus on that. And we do understand implementing these policies takes a huge effort at the local and state levels. So these are just some recommendations that we have, some things that you'd want to think about, but definitely tune into our upcoming webinar for that.
Great, thank you. Lost my place, 1 second. Will there be a required standard for community engagement in the grant applications, or will it be a point system that helps decide preferability of an application based on their engagement activities?
Sorry, you want to go ahead, Gilbert?
Yeah, I can go ahead. I think this will be something that we address in our notices of funding opportunities.
Yeah.
So that is a great question. But I think not to punt it down the road a couple months, but we'll have to wait to see what the notices of funding opportunities define for that. But I'm glad you're thinking on that along that line. Are private providers considered stakeholders for engagement? I know we talked a lot about state and local engagement here, but a question that did come up in the chat is, are they considered stakeholders?
Yeah, I think so. I know we were remiss in not including them under the private bucket on potential stakeholders, but I think they have expertise that they can bring to the table and knowledge that could be useful for the particular community that they service. So yes, I would consider them a stakeholder.
Good, thank you. Let's see here. As an individual business looking to lead, can I take point and start setting up this in my local? Who should I find to see if there's anyone working on this?
So I think, sorry, Gilbert, I don't want to talk over you. Were you gonna?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
No, please go ahead.
I think, we talk a lot about state and local governments, but the business community is going to be really critical in this conversation. But again, state and local governments can help be that anchor for the business community and other stakeholders. So I would recommend that you look at the local or county government that you're in, see if broadband is a topic of conversation amongst the local leaders or department heads there. If you want to email us at Broadband for All, happy to have a conversation with you to help you navigate who in your community might be the best to speak to. But I think I would start with someone in your local government to begin this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. The next question I see in our queue is, how can we tailor our approach for dealing with tribal localities? And I think we at NTIA know that the tribal communities and nations, tribal nations are a crucial stakeholder for a lot of these programs, and oftentimes live in underserved communities. So I think it's really important that everybody need to think about those now. I think making similarly to like you would do with localities, understanding who the leaders are in those communities, but also working with your state to identify who are those tribal liaisons. A number of states have tribal liaisons who can help connect you to begin conversations. I think it's also important to recognize that. We at NTIA have a tribal team whose job is to work on tribal outreach coordination and nation-to-nation dialogue. And we're always happy to help facilitate conversations as well. The next question I see is, should we wait for the NOFO before reaching out to the state broadband office? I'm going to say no. You should absolutely start having a conversation with your broadband office now. It's going to be very crucial to reach out to your state broadband office now, have a conversation about what you're seeing in your local communities, and how you can help provide that information, data, connections, partnerships, to make sure that your state can put forward the best projects possible in order to ensure the success of these IIJA programs. Julie, I don't know if you have anything to add.
The only thing I would add as soon as this webinar is over, go to our website, find out who your state broadband contact is, and just send them off a quick email. It's just so critical to start opening those lines of conversation with them. So the sooner the better.
Mhm. Absolutely. How do we include ISPs in local government and local engagement, excuse me, that individual organizations may be doing now?
I think for local governments, I think however you engage other service providers in your other, non-community stakeholders or not non-community organization stakeholders, I would recommend that as a starting point with bringing those service providers to the table. Again, I think like everything is so critical, everything needs to be done now, but I think that would be another good first step. I've given you so many first steps already, but I think that would be a good thing to do as you're preparing to have these, whereas as you're preparing for the funding to come, that's another stakeholder group that you definitely want to have conversations with.
I agree. Can we give any feedback at this time on how the NOFO and funding applications will work with the new broadband mapping system and data collection that is still being developed? And I believe that this question is referencing the FCC's new mapping system that it's developing under the Broadband Data Act. I know it recently announced its fabric provider or contractor. And I'm happy to start. I do know that speaking specifically to the Bead program, applicants must there is a prioritization mechanism of funding and serving the unserved communities first, and then moving to the underserved communities, and then community anchor institutions that who lack gigabit service. And the statute lays out that NTIA will leverage the FCC map that is being developed. But by all means, please make sure that you're engaging with your states to work on their data collection as well, in order to put forth good applications as well. I don't know if you have anything to add.
I think you're good.
Okay. Here, as related to Bead, the Bead program, is local engagement required? Participant, for example, could a not-for-profit cooperative electrical utility partner with an ISP with an approval by the state's broadband office? The local government.
I think I would defer to the NOFO on that. The NOFO will outline for whatever particular program. I think you mentioned the Bead program, but that'll outline in more detail the eligible participants and how the funding can be applied and how the eligible participant can apply for that funding.
Yeah, I agree. Let's see here. This person said they are a minority small business that can scale broadband services through partner relationships with an outside vendor services. Does that help streamline this process? I'm actually not sure.
I'm not sure either, but I heard you say partner, and I think that's another critical thing that we want to highlight as states and localities and everybody comes together to make sure everybody in their community has broadband access. The more you can highlight your partnerships, like you said, the greater efficiencies that are there, the more collaboration that's there. I think that's important. And I should also, flip around. I know, we're giving you a lot of high level information, but at the end of the day, you all are going to be doing the work. You all are going to kind of see the successes and challenges and pitfalls. And I just want to remind everyone, please make sure to share those experiences with us, because you're not the only one going through this. And the more that we can we know who's doing what, and we can connect like communities with each other, the more successful everybody will be.
Agreed. The next question I have for you, Julia, from the local side is, for local government, can we, NTIA, speak to the content of community engagement as opposed to process and how to manage that engagement? What feedback should local government seek from that outreach?
Sorry if I went frozen there for a second. I think ironically, connection is not the strongest that it should be. But I think your question, Gilbert, before you cut out, was what kind of conversation should local government be having with the community? I think the most important ones are, do they have access? If they have access, are they subscribing to it, and why not? Is it an affordability issue? Is the cost of subscription too high? Do they not have the technology tools, computers, that kind of stuff? What are the barriers for using technology for people in your community? Again, is it the access, or is it just the inability to get those resources they need?
Great, thank you. Let's see here. Does the state/counties, cities who applies for funding from our program before, after, or do they apply before or after they release an RFP for bids on building and maintain the network? If before, is the dollar amount on the application? How is the dollar amount on the application determined? I think, Julia may sound a little bit like a broken record, but what I'm going to say is you'll have to wait for the notices of finding opportunity for those programs, since they'll all have unique rules. And this may be a conversation you have to have with those, city, county, state, since I know a lot of them also have their own procurement rules and laws that they have to follow. So you'll want to consult those entities as well to make sure that you're both following the NOFO rules and guidelines that are set forward, but also state and local laws around procurement for those entities.
Absolutely.
Let's see here. This person said that they are employed with the public housing agency, which provides free broadband Wi-Fi through a collaboration with the provider as the ISP to its residents. How can these funds, NTIA funds, support what they're currently doing and have in place?
I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to that question. I would talk to your state broadband office, and Gilbert, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know that any of these funds that will become available are for projects for reimbursement. I think they're for new projects, but I love what you're doing. So I hope you do reach out to us and share examples of this project.
Yeah, that may be something we'll have to direct to broadband for all at NTIA.gov, and we can help connect you further on that. I think Julie is absolutely right. On the previous NTIA broadband meeting, this individual organization was told that open access network designs were preferred. Should this organization recommend to communities to focus on open access broadband projects?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry, but if you want to email us at Broadband for All, we can look into that in a little more detail.
How is NTIA thinking about ensuring coordination in metropolitan regions that cross multiple state boundaries? For example, you have Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas. Washington, D.C., where I live, I know crosses, multiple jurisdictions as well as, the New York and the tri-state area?
I think this is a good conversation again to have with your state broadband offices and your state, county, and municipal associations, because they're that are more intimately aware of and understand these issues, and I'm sure it's on their radar. So I think they would be good people to talk to.
Agreed. Let's see here. The next question is, our local government currently has zero involvement in broadband development. They're very, very rural in Alaska, but need broadband but the need for broadband is high. How can a small local municipal government, such as this one that we've described, be effective in the start of this process, or to start this process?
Right, I'm going to beat this drum one more time. Talk to your state broadband office.
I agreed.
Again, the Bead program priorities are connecting communities that don't have access, essentially. So I hate to punt you to somebody else, but I think they're going to be your best bet in this. And again, like just opening up those lines of communication as soon as you can.
No, but I would 100% echo what Julia says there. Those unconnected communities, unserved communities are the priority of the Bead program. NTIA does have relationships with all states, and I'm more than happy to make introductions, and those state broadband contacts are also on the state broadband page of our Broadband USA website. So we're more than happy to. I think those are the communities that we really want to prioritize, so make sure you start those conversations with your state early about the need and about the challenges to deployment in your community are going to be key. Will NTIA have a list of state broadband offices once they are created? Bead. Yes, we do maintain our state broadband office. I know that there are a number of states that don't have state broadband offices, but NTIA currently does for a person who's responsible for broadband in the state. So I know while not every state has a formal office, we do have someone who is responsible for it. And I know that there are a number of states that have legislation currently in process to create that, but my colleague Catherine Bates and I do maintain those relationships and are in constant communication and coordination with those states. So as we get that information, we do our best to update that website that page on the Broadband USA website. So I just want to take a moment to address that question in the Q&A that you're heard, but we do work to make sure that information is made readily available. And we're happy to make an introduction with the contact of the person who does work on broadband, even if they're not in a formal office yet.
And I just saw something in the chat about certain states like Alaska not having a broadband office. And please know that, as Gilbert mentioned, he and our other colleague, Catherine Bates, work very closely with the State Broadband Leaders Network. And part of their work is working with each state to ensure state broadband offices have what they need, whatever division in the state who's doing broadband work. So at NTIA, there is awareness of what states will need to make sure they're able to implement these funds effectively. So your point about Alaska not having a state broadband office is well taken. And again, if you are from a community in Alaska, please make sure you're connected to us so we can make sure to connect you to the right people once they're in place.
Absolutely. Here, if we submitted a project or a program for the previous broadband adoption and infrastructure NOFO, I believe they're referring to the broadband infrastructure program that we released awards for. Can we resubmit the same package for this NOFO? We are in a very unique geographical area here on the North Slope of Alaska, and we'll strategize how to get the appropriate broadband here. I think, similar to a lot of questions, I think there's going to be something hard to wait for the NOFO, notice of finding out opportunity for our programs. However, I would encourage you to reach out to myself, and I'm happy to make an introduction with your Alaska point person. I believe, as Julia mentioned earlier, that the letter of intent to apply for those funds does have to come from the state, not a locality. So we're happy to make the introduction so you can begin sharing your local priorities and needs with the state so that they're aware to put for the best information possible to us. Do you have anything else, Julia?
Nope, I think you got it.
Okay, so this person said that they are aware that this question may be for after the NOFO, but if they are approaching current stakeholders for the tribal broadband connectivity application, they know that they will be asked, will this new effort require a new application?
I think you're right, Gilbert. I think that would be a question for our tribal connectivity broadband program.
Yeah, I think that person's right. I think that's gonna be a question we have to put on pause for the appropriate notices of funding opportunity to be published. Let's see here. This individual said all states who apply with an identified plan will be awarded funding to address digital equity, correct? I think they may be referencing both the planning and capacity building programs in the Digital Equity Act, if you want to address that, Julia.
The question that just came up in the chat.
Yes, towards the.
Sorry, we're looking at different places where these questions are coming in. Could you just repeat it for me real quick? Sorry about that.
Yeah, so this individual asked, will all states who apply with an identified plan be awarded funding to address digital equity, correct? And I believe that they're referencing the state planning and capacity building programs in the Digital Equity Act.
Yeah, yes. So like Gilbert had mentioned, the Digital Equity Grant Program, they'll come out in 3 phases. The first one is the Planning Grant Program. The notice of funding opportunity for that program will be out around mid-June, I believe. So that'll outline the application process for applying for funds for developing that state digital equity plan. And then once that grant program has completed, then we'll move on to the capacity grant program. And then there'll be additional funds available that you can apply for implementation of that plan that you've developed.
Great, thank you. Making sure I do a quick scan. Trying to make sure I'm not skipping any kind of questions.
Mm-hmm.
What are some key policy questions which NTIA would recommend that states take to local governments and other stakeholders for input?
I think that, like I had mentioned before, we'll be doing a webinar on enabling conditions in a couple of weeks, which can talk about some local policies that you may want to put in place to help increase broadband deployment. But I also think this could be a conversation that you have with your stakeholders. I mean, like I said, and you all know this better than we do, every community is unique, and there may be other policy decisions outside of streamlining permitting processes or Dig Once policies that are unique to your community and your situation that you might find need to be put into place. So again, I think you might identify these as you have your conversations with your stakeholders.
Thank you, Julia. is a funding requirement that the state and or local entity own the infrastructure deployed using Bead funds. If the county sets up a public-private partnership, can the private company own the infrastructure but contractually be held responsible for delivering broadband internet? I think, again, this may be a question that we have to wait for notice as a funding opportunity. It sounds like for either Bead or middle mile. But that's a great question.
Yeah.
I think that's good that you're thinking about that.
Yeah, and I think it also might also rely on the terms of the agreement that you have in place with your private partner.
I think it may also agree on state, or may also depend on state laws too. So you may want to begin looking into what state laws and what states are not allowed to own and or operate. When do we estimate the data data maps? I believe the Broadband Data Act maps that the FCC is working on will be published. How long would you estimate the validation process to take? Asking since mapping service for unserved and underserved, et cetera, is a critical element for funding. I do not have a timeline for when those maps will be published. What I can say is that NTIA does have an interagency coordinator who works very extensively with the FCC. We're very aware that those maps are crucial to our programs. So we meet regularly and are coordinating regularly with the FCC in order to ensure that those maps will be able to be leveraged in a timely fashion. So that's where I leave that question.
Yeah, I would make sure to that you all are also connected to the FCC. The FCC has an intergovernmental advisory committee that has state and local government representatives on that committee. They do a lot of work with state and local governments as well. So I would just make sure you're staying connected with the FCC. They've provided a lot of resources on the development of their maps, including the challenge process. I think a lot of people are aware that that states will be challenging the FCC maps when they do come out. And I saw that they have a webinar on the FCC challenge process. So, please make sure you're connected to the FCC and, you're in the loop on what they're doing as well.
Yeah, I agree. There's about 10 minutes here, so I'll make sure we can get to as many as we can. See here. This individual stated that they are in Pennsylvania. The new broadband authority said that it will take 2 years to map the unserved and underserved areas and be eligible for federal funds. We can't wait that long and to start and to continue projects that they've been already known areas of need. How do they access funds now rather than 2 years from now?
So, depends on your state. I know other states are getting a lot of money for broadband through the Treasury with ARPA funds. Some states might already have broadband programs in place. I know this question is very specific to Pennsylvania, but for other communities who are having that challenge as well, I would look to see what other funding sources are available for you now that might meet current needs.
Yes. Additionally, I do want to point out that the IIJA statute, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, does state that the new FCC maps will inform the unserved and underserved populations. So please keep that aware and bring that into the conversation if it's helpful for federal eligibility when applying to both Bead and Digital Equity Act programs. Will there be required standards for community engagement in the grant application? Oh, I think we did it. Maybe we did. I think we did answer that one. But yes, we'll have more information on community engagement and local engagement activities outlined in the NOFO. Let's see here. This individual said they represent a locality or a tribal government. However, a state is quote unquote behind and does not yet have a state broadband office, but is currently in the process of creating one. Are there actions that can be taken by localities to either assist the state in information in creating that office of the state at the state level, or to do preemptive work in the absence of a state-specific office?
Yeah, I think some of the things that we've talked about already, some of the critical pieces that a state broadband office would be looking to localities to provide or validate is what access looks like in your community, doing that local coordination amongst your community stakeholders. And again, another plug for your state, county, and municipal associations. You all know they do a lot of state level advocacy work for you too. So working through them to advocate for a broadband office, and not just a broadband office, because a lot of times people might look at it as just a broadband person, but a fully staffed broadband office that will have the capacity to effectively implement these programs.
Yeah, I agree. Again, our state broadband leaders network does at least have a contact of a person who can help connect you, and I'm sure has more information on what your state processes look like. This individual said that they are in the process of creating one. So that person, I'm sure, has more insight and can help connect you to the right people. This individual also stated they're a tribal government. So if you're in a similar situation, I would reach out to your tribal coordinator within your state governmental structure and see what they can do as well to help connect you to resources or connect you to the correct people who are in the process of developing that office. But I think just making sure that you're able to articulate the need in your community, where that need exists, and the gaps and the challenges to deployment or adoption is going to be key. Make sure you have that data to tell a story. Will the NOFOs notice the funding opportunities conditions be binding on every local government, or will the local governments have the ability to adapt the terms and conditions to account for local conditions? I believe that may be a question we have to wait for those specific NOFOs, since there are going to be more than just one theme that are published, and each one is going to have their own nuances. So I think we may have to wait for that question to be more specific to when each applicable NOFO is published.
Yeah, sorry, I hate to say we'll defer to the NOFO, but a lot of the NOFO will be defining a lot, the specifics of the questions that have been asked here today.
Make sure I mark also correctly the answer in this queue. Are institutions of higher education eligible to receive broadband services through any IIJA programs for distance learning or other educational services? Yeah, I think for some specific eligibility questions, we may have to defer to those notices of funding opportunities, since those will define them. A number of the programs that NTIA has been authorized to administer do have pretty tight restrictions. For example, the Bead program is restricted to states submitting that letter of intent, but there may be opportunities. We'll have to wait for those specific eligibility requirements to be published in the notices of funding opportunities.
Yeah, and I will direct you to some of our previous webinars that we've done on the various programs, the Bead program, digital equity, middle mile. If you go through those slide decks, it'll give you a sense of the eligible entities that can either partner with the state or apply to the state for these funds. We also have a really quick and dirty 2-pager on the 4 IIJA programs that NTIA will be administering that you can look at too. And you can find all this information on the NTIA state, specifically on our state and local government pages. So if you click on resources and then click on state and local governments, you can find this information there.
Great, thank you, Julia. Let's see here. The law says a governor shall designate an entity to create the state digital equity plan, which will receive the funds and administer them by making sub-grants. Can we speak a little more about that process, how that process will work, and how much money each state will receive?
So for the state digital equity plans, it is a competitive grant program. States will have to apply for these funds. There's no funds set aside specifically from that program for states, but under the Bead program, states will receive a minimum allocation of $100 million and then additional funds based on the number of high cost and served areas in their states. Again, this will be determined by those FCC maps. And again, the Bead program, the focus already are connecting those unserved, underserved communities and community anchor institutions without gigabit connections. And I think I saw a question in the chat about the definitions of unserved and underserved communities. Again, the NOFO will outline those in more detail, but a general rule is that unserved areas are defined as areas that don't have access to speeds of 25.3, and underserved are those that don't have access to speeds of 120.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. And I do know that we had, we're approaching the end of the time, and I do see quite a few questions about when individuals can get the transcripts or video recordings for this session after the presentation. So I do want to address that before going to our last slide, our closing slide. And this presentation, along with the recording, will be available, and a full transcript, excuse me, will be available on the NTIA website by Wednesday, March 30th. And on the Broadband US website, there is a past events page. So if you go to events and past events, that's where this will live. So we'll have it, this information I'll publish by next Wednesday at the latest. So stay tuned. We do have to make sure we're accurately transcribing things, but we will get that published as soon as we can. And with that, I think that concludes this webinar and Q&A session. We know there are a number of great questions we weren't able to get to. To ask more detailed questions about the IIJA programs, our Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act programs, please email us at broadbandforal@ntia.gov. We do have a number of other webinars that are coming up, and these are open to the public, and they will be on April 6th, April 27th, and May 11th. For more information on those webinars and to sign up, please visit the website on your screen, which will also be included in the slides. All right, and thank you very much, everyone.